It was barely 8 a.m., but the air inside the Roosevelt Room already felt heavy, not with heat, but with performance. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a staging ground, a set, a performance cloaked in policy. The walls, cream-colored and lined with framed portraits of past presidents, seemed to lean in, waiting to witness another choreographed act of Washington politics. The chairs had been arranged with eerie precision, the microphones tested and retested. C-SPAN cameras mounted discreetly in corners, angled to capture clean shots of calm leadership and supposed unity. Donald Trump sat at the head of the long wooden table like a man about to conduct a symphony. But the music today was all for show. To his left, Senator Geller of Wisconsin already flipping through talking points. To his right, Secretary of Education smiling just a little too wide. Across from them, members of both parties, each clutching folders like shields, prepared to recite their parts. And then there was her, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Not loud, not theatrical, just deliberate. She entered without an entourage. No cameras followed her in. She wasn't wearing a designer label or a loud color. But somehow, the moment she stepped into the room, the temperature shifted. Not visibly, not dramatically, but the kind of subtle shift that only instincts catch. She sat near the end of the table, far from the center of power, at least in layout. But there was a certainty in the way she moved, a quiet steel. She carried a slim leather folder under her arm. It looked ordinary. It wasn't. To most in the room, this was another low-stakes morning in Washington. A few headline-friendly sound bites. A surface-level discussion about education reform that would change nothing. They didn't know that one question, one sentence, would bring that carefully staged act crashing down. They didn't know that today the script would be broken. She didn't enter like a disruptor. She entered like someone who had been carrying something for a very, very long time. Jasmine Crockett's face was unreadable, calm, but focused. Her posture said everything. This wasn't her first time in a room that didn't want her there. She had flown in from Dallas just hours earlier, arriving close to midnight. There were no aides, no hotel suite, just a red-eye flight, a borrowed car, and a leather folder clutched like armor. She hadn't slept, but she didn't look tired. She looked ready. Inside that folder, not talking points, not partisan ammo, just truth. Handwritten letters from teachers in South Dallas, from parents who sent their kids to schools with crumbling ceilings, from students who wrote in pencil because their schools had run out of ink. One teacher had written, "Congresswoman Crockett, I'm not asking for miracles, just chairs. My kids sit on the floor." Jasmine read that letter twice, then packed it. Because she hadn't come to make a moment, she came to make a case. She didn't wear fire on her sleeve, but it was there in her spine, in her walk, in the way she opened that folder, as if the stories inside were more sacred than sound bites. She wasn't here for the camera, she was here for the kids, and no one in that room was ready for what that meant. She didn't raise her voice, she didn't slam her folder. She didn't start with, "I demand," or "I object." She started with a truth so quiet, so human, it cracked the performance like a whisper in a play. "Mr. President," she said evenly, "in my district, we don't even have air conditioning. Teachers bring their own supplies." There it was. No drama, no accusation. Just a mirror, held up in front of a room full of people who preferred polished reports over raw reality. You could hear the hum of a ceiling vent, the slight creak of someone shifting in their chair, a cough. And then she asked the one question no one had the stomach to answer. Why is it still this bad? When do we stop pretending it's working? There was no response, not at first, only silence. But silence in a room full of power says everything. Trump didn't answer. He didn't even look at her. He leaned back, tapped his index finger on the table, twice. That was the order. Seconds later, the door near the side of the room clicked open. 2 members of White House security entered. Calm, trained, visible enough to intimidate, but not to alarm the press. But the message was clear. She had asked the wrong question, to the wrong man, in the wrong room. The room froze. No one moved. Not the advisors, not the senators. Not even the press behind the velvet ropes. 2 security officers stepped in tall, expressionless, trained to make their presence louder than their footsteps. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their uniforms did the talking. Their arrival was the reply. The tension was instant, like a dropped glass just before it shatters. You could feel the oxygen in the room shrink. Every eye turned, not toward the president, but toward her, toward Jasmine Crockett. And she didn't even blink. No panic, no confusion, just a woman sitting at a table with her hands folded over a folder full of truth. One of the guards paused near her chair, his body rigid but uncertain. He was waiting for the next signal, a nod, a gesture, a word. The press didn't know whether to keep filming or look away. Advisors shifted in their seats, eyes darting between Trump and the Congresswoman, unsure whether this was a misunderstanding or a moment they'd all have to explain later on live TV. You could hear a pin drop, and in the back of the room, someone did drop a pen, and it sounded like a gunshot. No one knew what to expect. Not the guards, not the president, not even the press. Would she protest, raise her voice, stand in defiance? But instead, Jasmine Crockett did something far more powerful. She looked up, her eyes steady, and said, "I'm just asking a question. That's it. No shouting, no speech, no spectacle. Just 7 words, calm, direct, and undeniable." It was the kind of sentence that hits harder because it's so simple, because it reveals the absurdity of the moment without needing to explain it. You could feel the discomfort ripple across the room, the kind of discomfort that comes not from volume, but from truth. The young guard standing closest to her shifted his weight. His jaw tightened slightly. He was trained to respond to escalation, but this wasn't that. She hadn't disrupted. She hadn't threatened. She'd simply spoken, and that apparently was enough to get security involved. Cameras kept rolling. Every lens was now on her, and still she didn't blink. Didn't flinch. Didn't fold. She sat there surrounded by power and refused to let anyone make her feel small for asking what needed to be asked. And then, from across the table, came a voice no one expected. Senator Howard Geller, Republican, from Wisconsin, a man more known for his quiet golfing weekends than political courage. He adjusted his glasses, leaned forward slightly, and said, "She didn't threaten anyone." It wasn't loud. It wasn't defiant. But in that moment, it was revolutionary. Heads turned. Staffers froze. Trump's eyebrows lifted slightly as if trying to calculate the weight of the words. But the damage had been done. Because once one person breaks the script, everyone else realizes they're allowed to think for themselves too. A shift swept across the room. You could see it not in outbursts, but in the subtle tension breaking. A senator from Utah glanced at her notes. An aide leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching Jasmine more intently now. The illusion of control, the order in that room was cracking. And Jasmine, she didn't capitalize on it. She didn't gloat. She didn't try to grandstand. She simply stood. Not abruptly, not with drama, just steady. "If asking about equity in public schools makes you uncomfortable," she said, "then maybe that's the conversation we need most." And then she slid her chair in, picked up her folder, and walked to the door. No protest, no apology. Just one unspoken truth left floating in the air, one question that no one in that room dared to answer. The doors closed behind her, but the moment it stayed wide open. Jasmine Crockett stepped out of the Roosevelt room not like someone who had been dismissed, but like someone who had just been seen. Truly seen. C-SPAN's camera didn't cut away. Instead, it followed her. Quietly. Respectfully. As if it understood that this wasn't just footage, it was history. Her heels tapped steadily on the marble floor, the sound echoing through the West Wing corridor. She didn't rush. She didn't glance back. And behind her, 2 security officers walked in silence, not as enforcers, but as escorts. You could feel it in the way the room faded behind her. This wasn't a removal. This was a rise. She hadn't been silenced. She'd been amplified. And even before she reached the White House gates, her name had already begun trending. Not because she shouted, not because she staged a moment, but because she did the one thing this country still knows how to recognize. She told the truth and walked out with her dignity intact. The story wasn't ending, it was just getting louder. The clip hit the internet like a lightning bolt. Someone had recorded it off the C-SPAN feed. It wasn't flashy, there were no edits. Just one wide shot, Jasmine Crockett seated calm, Trump leaning back silent, and security entering the frame. In under 10 minutes, the video spread across Twitter. In 20, it hit TikTok. By the hour mark, YouTube channels were reposting it with bold titles. She didn't flinch. Silenced for asking the truth. Congresswoman Crockett versus the president. And then came the hashtags #AskTheRealQuestions, #TruthInTheRoom. She did not blink. The country was divided, but united in one thing: everyone was watching. CNN called it a seismic political moment quietly delivered. Fox News had a different take. Crockett disrespected the presidency. But even they had to play the clip. Even they couldn't look away. Opinion pieces flooded the digital space. Reddit threads exploded with comments from educators, veterans, single moms, retired lawyers. One user wrote, "She said what we scream into the void every night." It wasn't just politics anymore. It was personal. For millions, Jasmine wasn't a politician. She was a mirror. It was just one sentence, 7 words, delivered without drama. But somehow it cracked open the silence of a nation. If asking about equity makes you uncomfortable, maybe that's the conversation we need most. That line became everything. It was printed on posters, shared in Instagram stories, scribbled on whiteboards in high school classrooms, reposted by teachers, bus drivers, nurses, and even military veterans. It wasn't just a soundbite. It was a sigh of relief finally said out loud by someone in the room. It was the kind of sentence that didn't need to be shouted. It only needed to be heard once to echo in 1,000 homes that had gone silent from trying for too long. One woman in Detroit recorded a TikTok from her car, eyes wet. "I've waited my whole life to hear someone say that," in front of him. Another teacher in rural Nevada wrote in the comment section, "I said that line out loud in the teacher's lounge and the whole room went quiet. Then they clapped." In a country addicted to noise, this one sentence cut through everything. And the woman who spoke it hadn't even opened her phone yet. She was just walking folder in hand, coat wrapped tight, headed toward a hotel room, unaware that her words had already taken flight. Inside the West Wing, the walls weren't shaking, but the staff were. By the time Jasmine reached her hotel room, the White House communications team was already in a closed-door emergency meeting. Phones buzzed on the table. Aides whispered. One junior staffer muttered what everyone was thinking. This wasn't supposed to happen. They'd planned a clean narrative, bipartisan unity, progress, order. Now the headline screamed, "Congresswoman removed after questioning school equity." A senior aide tossed a printed tweet onto the cable. Over 2 million views and counting. Another asked, voice tight, "Do we smear her, paint her as aggressive?" Someone across the room snapped, "She didn't yell, she made them listen." That line hung in the room like smoke. because that was the problem. She hadn't given them anything to weaponize. No tantrum, no disrespect, just a calm question they never prepared to answer. The press secretary sat frozen, flipping through briefing notes. We could say she disrupted the roundtable. Silence. Even the spin team knew this time the footage told the truth. Within hours, the country split down the middle. On one side, supporters rallied behind Jasmine's calm defiance. Teachers, parents, veterans, cafeteria workers, they weren't just watching, they were claiming her. On the other came the backlash. Cable pundits on conservative networks called her performative. Talk radio hosts asked if she had planned the moment. Social media trolls dissected her tone, her posture, even the color of her blazer. But there was one thing neither side could ignore. Everyone was sharing the clip. Because it wasn't just a moment, it was a mirror. And what it reflected was making a lot of people very uncomfortable. In a church basement in Mississippi, a retired teacher named Gloria turned to the screen, tears in her eyes, and whispered, "She said what we've been screaming into silence for decades. I've waited my whole life to hear someone say that in the White House." At a coffee shop in Vermont, a single dad showed his daughter the clip. She asked, "Is that lady real?" He smiled. "She's more real than most people you'll see on TV." It was messy. It was divided, but something had shifted, and the media couldn't look away. Because Jasmine Crockett, a congresswoman from Dallas, had walked into a room full of power and without raising her voice had started a political earthquake. Jasmine didn't tweet, didn't do a press interview, didn't post a filtered selfie with a caption. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed, shoes off, legs tucked under, and just stared at the glowing screen in her hand. Hundreds of missed messages, thousands of mentions, millions of views, but still she said nothing. It wasn't a strategy, it was exhaustion, it was grace. Because sometimes when the world is shouting, silence becomes the loudest answer. And that silence wasn't empty. It filled newsrooms, it filled classrooms. It filled the living rooms of retired farmers and working moms. It made people ask, why hasn't she spoken yet? What is she thinking? Is she okay? Some thought her silence meant she was overwhelmed. Others thought it was a tactic. But for many, it was sacred. A few voices cut through the noise. One letter, handwritten, arrived at her Dallas office days later. It was from a retired Republican Army veteran from Idaho. No return address. Just shaky cursive handwriting. You didn't raise your voice, Congresswoman. You raised a mirror. And that was the truth. She had forced the nation to look at itself without screaming, without blaming, just by daring to speak. The pushback came quickly, and it came loud. Senators went on cable news calling her radical. Press secretaries used words like disruptive, disrespectful, uninformed. Think tanks rushed out op-eds. One headline read, "The Dangers of Performative Politics in the People's House." It was coordinated, disciplined, calculated. But there was just one problem: none of it was working. Why? Because the clip was too real. There was no spin to apply, no gotcha moment to weaponize, no screaming, no stunts, just a calm voice asking an inconvenient truth. Why is the system still this broken? The more they attacked, the more people watched the video, and the more they saw that she didn't attack anyone. In fact, the smear campaign backfired. A retired Republican teacher in Utah wrote online, "You can disagree with her, but you can't fake what that room felt like." And a young journalist from Politico tweeted, "I've watched the footage 5 times, still no disruption, just clarity." The political machine had underestimated something rare: authenticity. And for the first time in a long time, a moment of truth was drowning out the noise. It didn't come from party leaders. It didn't come from polished PR firms or insider pundits. It came from 1,000 cracks in the surface of America. A third-grade teacher in Detroit posted a picture, Mold on the ceiling desks, falling apart, one broken heater for 30 children. The caption read, "This is what we walk into every morning. Thank you, Congresswoman." A single mother in Alabama posted a selfie with her daughter, no internet, no transportation, but both watching Jasmine's clip on a borrowed phone. A veteran in Texas stitched Jasmine's speech on TikTok, saying through misty eyes, "She didn't make it about politics, she made it about us." A school bus driver wrote on Facebook, "No one ever asks what we see. Jasmine did. She spoke for us." And then came a wave of students, teenagers, high schoolers, even elementary kids using hashtags like #SheAskedForMe, #MyClassroom2, #WhyWeCryAtSchool. It wasn't just a movement, it was a reckoning. Because when a congresswoman asked the most basic of questions, why is the system still broken? She gave permission for everyone who had been living in the brokenness to speak. They weren't radical, they weren't angry, they were just tired. And Jasmine had said calmly but clearly, "I see you." No cameras, no podiums, no motorcade. Just a borrowed car and a handwritten schedule, and Jasmine Crockett walking school hallways lined with finger paintings and broken drinking fountains. She didn't want applause, she wanted to listen. And in a second-grade classroom in rural Arkansas, a little girl with big glasses raised her hand. "Are you scared when you talk to powerful people?" The class went quiet. Even the teacher froze. Jasmine smiled, not the practiced one from interviews, but the kind that comes when truth meets innocence. She crouched beside the girl and said gently, "Every single time. But I do it anyway." And in that moment, power changed hands, not from politician to citizen, but from fear to courage. Across the country, more classrooms invited her. Community centers, nursing homes, church basements, libraries. Everywhere she went, people didn't want policies. They wanted proof they mattered. And she gave it with eye contact, with stories, with silence that honored their pain. But just as hope was blooming, the first envelope came. No return address, no name, only one line typed in all caps, "Stay quiet or we won't." Then another and another. It started with one TikTok video. A teacher in Cleveland, Ohio, standing in front of cracked windows and books from 1993. He spoke directly into the camera. "You want to talk about politics? My classroom still has a chalkboard with holes in it. My students share one broken tablet between 5 kids. This is what Jasmine was talking about." The video went viral overnight, but it didn't stop there. By the end of the week, hundreds of educators had posted their own 60-second truths. Teachers in Phoenix, Boston, Atlanta, rural Mississippi, downtown LA. A hashtag began trending, #ClassroomsNotPolitics. One by one, stories poured in. A science teacher using expired lab kits. A music room with no instruments. A school nurse with no EpiPens. A hallway that floods every time it rains. They didn't scream, they didn't blame. They showed. And in showing, they did something Washington hadn't managed in decades. They united. Parents began sharing the videos. So did veterans. So did former students who had once sat in those same crumbling desks. This wasn't about Democrats or Republicans anymore. It was about a blackboard that wouldn't erase and a generation that refused to be ignored. It started with a shirt, white cotton, black bold letters, a quote across the chest. "If asking about equity makes you uncomfortable, maybe that's the conversation we need most." No logo, no politician's name, just truth wearable. By Monday, those shirts were everywhere. High schoolers wearing them in front of the flagpole. Middle school students lining up outside their crumbling schools. Teachers wearing them to parent-teacher conferences. Then came the marches. In Chicago, 2,000 students walked out during lunch and sat on the front steps chanting, "We are the question." In Oakland, teachers formed a human chain around a school with no functioning bathrooms. In Atlanta, kids marched holding signs made from torn folders and cereal boxes reading, "My class is broken, fix it." And across it all, one face appeared again and again, not as a savior, but as a spark, Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't on a stage, she didn't even post about the protests. But everywhere her sentence echoed, "I'm just asking a question." What Washington saw as disrespect, an entire generation saw as courage. They didn't need permission, they needed momentum. And Jasmine had given them that. The banner stretched wide behind the anchor desk. CNN special Who Gets to Ask the Hard Questions? A primetime forum. Not just pundits and politicians. Tonight it was teachers, students, single mothers, factory workers, veterans. And Jasmine Crockett front and center, but not alone. What started as a tense White House exchange had now exploded into a nationwide debate about power, silence, and truth. The moderator posed the central question: are some questions too uncomfortable for democracy to face? A teacher from Detroit answered, if students can ask about slavery, senators can handle a question about equity. A mother from Mississippi said, I've taught my kids to speak up. Why are adults punished when they do? And then came him. An elderly farmer from Kentucky. Baseball cap, plaid shirt, sun-worn hands. He leaned into the mic like he was talking to the camera, not a studio. Y'all talking about respect for the presidency. I say this, if a question makes the president nervous, he paused, took a breath, maybe he ain't doing his job. The room went silent, then erupted. Jasmine didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply whispered, "That's all I've been saying." She didn't choose a stage. She didn't want a podium or bright lights. Instead, Jasmine Crockett stood in the cafeteria of a Title I school in South Dallas. No press, just kids. And the same smell of floor wax and fried food from decades ago. This school had been in one of her earliest campaign videos. Back then, it was a symbol of everything broken. Today, it was full not just of students, but of possibility. Jasmine walked to the front of the room, no security in sight. She held the mic like it was borrowed. Her voice was calm, honest. When I went to school here, we didn't have dry erase boards. We wrote on lined paper and taped it to the walls. Our teacher brought light bulbs from home. Sometimes we'd read by the hallway lights. She paused, looked around at the new generation. Back then, we didn't know we were being left behind. We just knew we had to find a way forward. Now, I want you to know, asking hard questions isn't disrespect. It's how we build something better. The kids clapped, not because they were told to, but because they felt it. There were no cameras this time, no viral clips, no screaming headlines, just a room, a warm wooden bench, and Jasmine Crockett, tired but unshaken. She had just stepped out of a closed-door federal hearing. Reporters waited outside. Aides whispered updates. But Jasmine, she sat alone for a moment, took off her heels, closed her eyes. Then she spoke, softly, to a staffer who had been with her since the beginning. I never asked to be a headline. I don't want to be a symbol. I want to be useful. Her voice cracked just slightly. If one kid speaks up in class because of this, if one teacher doesn't feel invisible, that's enough. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and walked toward the sunlight pouring through the courthouse doors. The courthouse hallway had mostly cleared. The noise was fading. Shoes clicked, doors slammed. But near the service elevator, an elderly janitor stood quietly. Uniform faded, hands calloused, eyes kind but tired. He didn't ask for a selfie. He didn't raise his voice. He just said, almost like a prayer, My granddaughter wants to be a teacher. I just want her to know she matters. Jasmine paused, not because she was surprised, but because she understood. She turned to face him fully, offered a gentle smile. She does. And don't let anyone tell her different. They didn't shake hands. They didn't hug. Just a moment. Two people. A quiet truth shared in a hallway. Not for the cameras, not for the history books, but maybe for the future. This story teaches us that courage isn't about loud speeches or grand gestures. It's about having the strength to ask the hard questions, to stand firm in your truth, and to speak up even when the world wants you to stay silent. Real change begins when ordinary people refuse to accept injustice, when they raise their voices with calm conviction, and when they support each other's fight for fairness and dignity. Remember, you don't have to be famous or powerful to make a difference. Sometimes all it takes is one brave question to start a movement. If this story moved you, if you believe in standing up for what's right, then don't stay silent. Join our community. Subscribe now to AZ Exposed for more powerful stories that reveal truth, challenge injustice, and inspire action. Hit the like button, share this video with your friends and family, and let's keep the conversation going, because together, our voices are unstoppable.